She didn't knock. She slammed her hand against my door like she owned the place. "Your fence is ruining my $1,000,000 view." Her voice sliced through the quiet mountain morning so sharply that the birds scattered from the trees behind my house. I hadn't even finished my first sip of coffee. And just like that, peace was over. I set the mug down slowly and walked to the door, already feeling that familiar shift in the air. The kind that tells you something small is about to turn into something much bigger. When I opened it, she was standing there like she had stepped out of a magazine. Perfect hair, designer sunglasses, immaculate outfit that probably cost more than my monthly expenses. Behind her, parked halfway into my driveway like it belonged there, was a gleaming white Escalade. She didn't introduce herself, didn't smile, didn't even pretend to be polite. Instead, she shoved a stack of papers into my chest. "You need to take that fence down," she said. "Immediately." I looked down at the documents in my hands. Legal language, HOA letterhead, bold phrases like property violation and community standards. I didn't need to read the rest. I already knew exactly what this was. I looked back up at her, calm. "And you are?" She blinked like I'd just insulted her. "Bethany Cromwell," she snapped. "I just bought the house next door." That explained everything. 3 weeks ago, the empty lot beside my property had turned into a construction site. 6 days, a week of noise. Dust hanging in the air, contractors moving like ants from sunrise to sunset. And now, this. I stepped slightly to the side and glanced past her toward the structure that had replaced the quiet patch of land I used to look at every morning. 8,000 square feet of glass, stone, and ego. The kind of house that didn't just sit. On land, it dominated it. The kind of place built to be seen, and apparently, she thought everything around it should adjust accordingly. I turned back to her. "The fence stays," I said. Her lips tightened instantly. "I don't think you understand," she replied, her voice dropping into that controlled tone people use when they're used to getting their way. "That fence is blocking my view of the mountains." I took a slow breath. That fence wasn't just wood. It wasn't just a boundary line. It was 8 feet of cedar I had cut, measured, and built with my own hands. Every board placed with purpose, every nail driven with intention, and behind it was something she would never understand. "My wife planted that garden," I said quietly. The words felt heavier than usual. "She passed away 2 years ago. That fence stays exactly where it is." For just a second, something flickered across her face. Not sympathy, not understanding, just irritation. Like I'd made things inconvenient. "Well," she said, brushing imaginary dust off her sleeve, "the dead don't need privacy." Everything went still. No wind, no birds, just silence. The kind of silence that changes something inside you. Right there, in that moment. She made a mistake, a very big one. Because I'm not the kind of man who yells. I don't argue. I don't slam doors or throw threats. I solve problems. For 40 years, that's what I did. Aerospace engineering. Systems that couldn't fail. Situations where mistakes weren't an option. You learn a certain kind of patience doing that work, a certain kind of precision, and a very specific way of dealing with problems. I looked at her for another second, then stepped back and closed the door without saying another word. But as I walked back into my kitchen, my mind was already moving, already calculating, already working through possibilities. She thought this was about a fence. It wasn't. It was about control, and people like her didn't ask. They pushed until something gave. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk with a laptop, a notepad, and a habit I'd built over decades. When something doesn't make sense, you research it. People always leave patterns, you just have to look close enough. Public records were the easiest place to start. Property purchases, sales histories, business filings. At first it looked normal, successful even. Then the pattern started to appear. 4 properties in 3 years, each one bought below market value, each one previously owned by someone who had filed complaints. Noise disputes, HOA pressure, legal threats. One case even mentioned harassment. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. So that was her game. She didn't just want a better view, she wanted leverage, pressure, control, push the right buttons, make life uncomfortable enough. And eventually people give in. Sell, leave, disappear, and she profits. I closed the laptop slowly. Then I stood up and walked to the window. The fence stretched across the edge of my property, solid and quiet in the moonlight. Behind it, the garden, rested in darkness. Roses my wife had planted. Wind chimes she had picked out. A bench where we used to sit every morning. For a moment, everything felt still again, like it used to. Then I thought about her standing on my porch. The way she said it, the "dead don't need privacy," I let out a slow breath. "No," I said quietly, "but the living do." And that's when something shifted. Not anger, not frustration, something sharper, more focused. Because if there's one thing 40 years of engineering teaches you, it's this. When someone creates a problem, you don't fight it, you redesign the system. I looked back out at the fence, then toward her massive house looming beyond the trees. And somewhere between those 2 points, an idea started forming. Not complete. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know this wasn't going to end the way she expected. Because if she wanted a better view, I was going to give her one. The best view she'd ever had. Clear, unobstructed, perfect. I just hadn't told her yet that it was going to come with a price, a monthly one, and she was going to pay it, whether she liked it or not. The next morning, she came back. This time, she knocked. Not politely, just loud enough to make a point. I opened the door to find her holding a tablet and a folder, dressed like she had somewhere important to be, even though it was barely past 8 a.m. "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't respond. She took that as permission to continue. "I've spoken with the HOA," she said, lifting the folder slightly. "And there are concerns about your fence." Of course there were. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting. She tapped her tablet and turned it toward me. Photos of my fence filled the screen. Different angles, zoomed-in shots, even aerial images. She'd been busy. "As you can see," she continued, "your structure obstructs key sight lines that directly affect neighboring property values." I almost smiled. "Interesting," I said. "Considering my fence has been here for 2 years." Her expression tightened for just a fraction of a second. "Standards evolve," she replied smoothly, "and the community has to adapt." Translation: "You need to adapt." "No," I said simply. The word landed heavier than anything else I could have said. Her smile dropped completely this time. "Look," she snapped, dropping the polite act. "I'm trying to do this the easy way. Take the fence down, plant something low, and we can move on." I straightened slightly. "And if I don't," she closed the folder with a sharp motion. "Then we escalate." 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. Thick paper, expensive ink, the kind of envelope meant to intimidate before you even open it. I didn't rush. I made coffee first, sat down at the kitchen table, then opened it. Notice of violation, mandatory. HOA review. Failure to comply may result in legal action. I read the entire thing twice. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand exactly how far she was willing to push this. Then I set it down and started taking notes. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday at her house. Of course it was. When I pulled into her driveway that morning, I got a better look at the place up close. Everything about it screamed excess, polished stone, floor-to-ceiling windows, perfect landscaping that looked like it had never seen a real season. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom. She opened the door before I could knock, like she'd been waiting. "Right on time," she said, stepping aside. Inside, it was even worse. White leather furniture, chrome fixtures, Massive abstract art pieces that probably cost more than my truck. And in the center of it all, a glass table set up like a courtroom. 2 other people were already seated. A man in his 40s, nervous, fidgeting with his phone, and a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Neither of them made eye contact. "Let's get started," Bethany said, taking her place at the head of the table. She tapped a remote. A projector hummed to life. And just like that, my fence was on the wall behind her. Slide after slide, photos, angles, diagrams, red lines drawn across images like crime scene markings. "This," she said, gesturing dramatically, "is the issue." I sat down slowly, resting my hands on the table. She continued like she was giving a presentation to investors. Multiple residents have expressed concerns regarding visual obstruction, property value impact, and overall aesthetic disruption. Multiple residents. I glanced at the other 2 people in the room. The man shifted uncomfortably. The woman stared at the table. Neither said a word. I looked back at Bethany. "Which residents?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "We're not here to name individuals. We're here to resolve a problem." "Of course." I nodded slightly. "Go on." She clicked to the next slide. "Charts, graphs, property comparisons. Properties with unobstructed mountain views consistently sell at a 20–30% premium," she explained. "Your fence directly interferes with that." There it was. Not about community. Not about standards. About money. Always money. I leaned back in my chair. "And how exactly does my fence affect your property value?" I asked. She smiled again, that same tight, controlled expression. "It blocks a portion of the western view from my kitchen and outdoor living space." I let the silence stretch for a second. Then I said, "So, this is about your kitchen window." The man at the table let out a quiet breath like he'd been holding it. Bethany ignored him. "This is about maintaining neighborhood standards," she said firmly. "No," I replied. "It's about you not getting what you want." That's when the tension shifted. Subtle, but real. The kind of shift you feel before something breaks. She clicked off the projector. The room went quiet. "Let me make this very clear," she said, her voice dropping. "If you don't remove that fence, we will pursue legal action. Fines, liens, forced compliance." There it was. The real strategy. Pressure, escalation. Make it expensive enough, and eventually people give in. I looked at the other 2 again. The man avoided my eyes. The woman looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't. Interesting. Very interesting. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder of my own, set it gently on the table. Bethany's eyes flicked down to it. "What's that?" she asked. "Just something I found while preparing for this meeting," I said. I opened it slowly. Inside were printed documents, public records, permits, property filings. I slid the first page across the table. "Your deck," I said. "Built without proper setback clearance." Her hand froze halfway to the paper. I slid another one. "Tree removal permit, never filed." Another. "Outdoor fountain installed over a utility easement." The room temperature dropped instantly. The man at the table stopped fidgeting. The woman finally looked up. Bethany didn't touch the papers, she just stared at me. "What is this?" she said quietly. "This," I replied, "is me doing what I always do when something doesn't add up." I leaned forward slightly. "You want to talk about violations?" Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. I turned to the man. "Ted, right?" He looked up, startled. I tapped another document. Business loan. $30,000. Co-signed by Bethany. His face went pale. Then I looked at the woman. Janet. She swallowed hard. Divorce settlement requiring approval for property changes. Also tied to Bethany. Her eyes filled with something close to relief. I sat back again. "And you're both here, representing multiple residents." Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Everything was already clear. I looked back at Bethany. Her composure was cracking now. Not completely, but enough. "You're not protecting the neighborhood," I said calmly. You're controlling it. Her jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate one. I let that sit for a moment, then added, and I don't respond well to pressure tactics. The silence stretched. No projector, no presentation. Just 3 people realizing something had shifted. Finally, Bethany stood up. This meeting is over, she said sharply. I didn't move. Good, I replied, because my answer hasn't changed. I stood, picked up my folder, and headed for the door. Before I stepped out, I paused, then looked back at her. You want the fence gone? I said it calmly, almost casually. Her eyes narrowed. Yes. I nodded once. All right. For the first time since this started. She smiled. A real one this time, like she'd just won. She had no idea that she'd just made the biggest mistake yet, because I wasn't going to fight her. I wasn't going to argue, and I definitely wasn't going to back down. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. The lawyer's letter arrived 3 days later, certified mail, signature required. The kind of envelope designed to feel heavy before you even open it. I signed for it, thanked the courier, and set it on the kitchen table like it was just another bill. Then I made coffee. Some habits don't change, no matter what's inside the envelope. When I finally opened it, the message was exactly what I expected. 15 days to comply, remove the fence or face legal action, financial penalties, and court costs for unreasonable interference with neighboring property enjoyment. I read it once, then again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand the strategy. It wasn't about winning in court. It was about pressure, time limits, legal language, financial threats. Make it stressful enough, expensive enough, and eventually people fold. That's how she'd done it before. That's how she thought she'd do it again. I set the letter down, took a sip of coffee, and stared. Out the window toward the fence, toward the garden behind it, toward the one thing I wasn't going to lose. No, I said quietly. Not to the letter, not to her. Just in general. That evening, I made a few calls. Old contacts. People I hadn't spoken to in years. When you spend 4 decades in aerospace engineering, especially the kind of work that comes with security clearance, you don't just build systems. You build networks, and those networks don't disappear when you retire. They just wait. Marcus? The voice on the other end said after the second ring. Haven't heard from you in a while. Need a favor, I replied. A pause. Then a chuckle. That usually means something interesting. It is. By the next morning, I had more information than Bethany ever expected anyone to find. Financial records, business filings, property histories across multiple counties, patterns, clear ones. Not just aggressive real estate practices, something deeper, something a lot less legal. I spread everything out across my kitchen table, organizing it the same way I used to map out system failures, cause.effect, chain reaction. Every move she made led to the same outcome. Target a property, apply pressure, create conflict, force a sale, profit over and over again. Different people. Same result. But what interested me more wasn't what she'd done in the past. It was what was happening right now. Because buried in all those records was a problem. Her problem. Debt. A lot of it. Loans tied to developments that hadn't gone the way she planned, investments that had stalled, payments that were overdue. I leaned back in my chair, connecting the pieces. This wasn't just about my fence. This was about timing. She needed something, fast, and my property was in the way. That's when the harassment started. Not direct. Not obvious, at least not at first. Little things. Subtle things. The kind of things that are easy to deny. It started with noise. Early mornings. Late evenings. Landscaping crews that seemed to work at the exact hours I liked to sit outside. Leaf blowers that ran just a little too long. Machines positioned just a little too close to the fence. At first, I ignored it. But then I started noticing patterns, consistency, intent. So I did what I always do. I documented everything. Cameras, audio, timestamps, every sound, every movement, every accidental disruption. Recorded, stored, catalogued. Then came the water. One afternoon, I stepped outside to find part of the garden soaked, not from rain, from her sprinklers, positioned just right to spray across the property line. I watched from the porch as the water hit the fence, dripping down onto the soil my wife had once cared. For every morning I didn't react, didn't walk over, didn't say a word, I just went back inside and added another entry to the file. A few days later, it escalated again. Music, loud, bass heavy, not random, timed, always during the hours I was home, always just enough to be disruptive, never enough to trigger immediate complaints, calculated, precise. Almost respected it, almost, because I recognized the strategy. Apply pressure. Wear the target down. Make daily life uncomfortable enough that eventually they give in. But she made one mistake. She assumed I'd react, that I'd get frustrated, that I'd engage. She didn't understand something very important. I don't react under pressure. I analyze it. One afternoon, that patience paid off. I was reviewing footage when I caught something interesting. Her, standing outside with her landscaping crew, pointing, directing, clear as day. "Blow it toward his side," she said, "and keep the noise up in the mornings." The audio was perfect, no distortion, no ambiguity, just her voice, giving instructions. I paused the video, replayed it, then saved 3 separate copies. Different drives, different backups, old habits. You don't rely on one system when the data matters. That night, I sat in my workshop, looking at everything I'd collected. Footage, documents, records, patterns. It was all there, every piece, every move she'd made, every step she thought no one was paying attention to. And that's when I realized something. Didn't need to fight her, I didn't need to respond to the lawyer. Didn't need to engage with the HOA because this wasn't a legal battle. It was a systems problem, and systems problems have better solutions. I walked over to my drafting table, cleared a space, pulled out a blank sheet. For a moment, I just stood, there, thinking. Not about her, not about the noise, not even about the fence, but about the outcome. What she wanted, what I wanted, and how those two things could intersect, in a way she'd never see coming. She wanted the fence gone. She wanted a clear view, unobstructed, open, perfect. I picked up a pencil and started drawing. At first it was just lines, rough shapes, angles. Then it started to take form. Something structural. Something precise. Something that didn't block the view, but redefined it. Glass. Not just any glass. Something stronger. Something permanent. Something that couldn't be challenged. Or easily removed. I paused, then smiled slightly. Because the idea wasn't just good, it was perfect. If she wanted a better view, I was going to give her one. Crystal clear, from edge to edge. 60 feet of it. But the real solution wasn't the wall, it was everything that came with it. I looked back at the files on my table, at the records, at the evidence, at the leverage, and that's when the final piece clicked into place. She thought this was about removing something. She thought she was forcing me to lose ground, but what she didn't understand was this. I wasn't removing anything. I was upgrading it, expanding it, turning it into something bigger. Something she couldn't fight. Something she couldn't ignore, and, most importantly, something she was going to pay for every month. I set the pencil down, looked at the design one more time, then folded the paper carefully. "All right," I said quietly. "Let's build it." The idea was solid, but ideas don't win battles, details do. And details live in places most people never think to look. 3 nights later, I was buried in county records, old ones, the kind that aren't fully digitized, scanned documents, faded ink, survey maps drawn by hand decades ago. Most people would have stopped after the first few files. I didn't. Because when something feels off, it usually is. You just haven't found where yet. Around 2:30 in the morning, I found it. At first, it Didn't look like much. A 1952 utility easement document, yellowed paper, technical notes. Boundary lines sketched with the kind of precision that only comes from engineers who didn't rely on software. I leaned closer, then closer, and then I saw it, a line, 12 feet wide, running directly along the edge of my property, extending into hers. I sat back slowly, then leaned forward again, this time with intent. Pulled up her property map. Overlaid the two, checked measurements, angles, coordinates. Once, twice, 3 times. Same result every time. Her property wasn't just next to mine. Part of it was on mine. Not metaphorically, not technically. Literally. That massive driveway she was so proud of, inside the easement, her decorative landscaping, inside the easement, that ridiculous fountain she kept bragging about, right on top of it. I let out a slow breath, then another. Because this wasn't just useful. This was everything. Utility easements don't disappear. They don't expire because someone builds over them. They don't care how expensive your house is or how important you think you are. They exist for one reason: access, control, authority, and legally. That strip of land still belonged to me. I spent the next 2 hours verifying everything, pulling additional records, cross-checking surveys, even calling an old contact who specialized in land use law. By sunrise, there was no doubt, for 4 years, she had been building, landscaping, and living on my easement. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The early morning light was just starting to touch the mountains. Her house sat there, quiet and perfect, completely unaware of what I now knew. I almost felt bad. Almost. Then I remembered her standing on my porch. The way she said it. The dead don't need privacy. No, I didn't feel bad. I went back to the table and started running numbers. Because if you're going to use leverage, you do it properly. Market rates for land usage, retroactive calculations, monthly access value, potential penalties. By the time I finished, the total sat in front of me like a final answer. $28,800 in back payments and $1,200 per month. Going forward. I stared at the numbers for a long moment. Not because they surprised me, but because of what they meant. This wasn't just defense anymore. This was control. She had tried to pressure me into giving something up. Now, she was the one, exposed, and legally I had options. Several. I could demand immediate removal of everything built on the easement, driveway, landscaping, fountain, all of it, which would have been devastating, expensive, time-consuming, or I could do something smarter. I picked up the easement document again, ran my fingers along the boundary line, 12 feet wide, perfectly positioned. Then I thought about my design, the glass, the structure, the idea I'd been refining over the past few days, and suddenly it wasn't just an idea anymore, it was a solution. Because here's the thing about easements. They don't just give you rights, they give you permission to build, to protect, to define the boundary however necessary, as long as it serves the purpose of the easement. I walked into my workshop and unrolled the design plans I'd started, looked at them again, but this time with new information, new constraints, new opportunities. The wall didn't need to sit where the fence was. It could sit on the easement line, which meant it would run directly alongside her property, closer than the fence ever had. I started adjusting the design, extending the length, refining the angles, incorporating support structures that stayed entirely on my side, while maximizing presence along the boundary. 60 feet, clear, unbroken. Perfect. But the real beauty of it wasn't the structure, it was the position. Because once it was built, that line wouldn't just exist on paper anymore. It would be visible, undeniable, permanent, a physical reminder of something she never bothered to check. I stepped back from the table, looking at the updated plans, and for the first time since this started, everything made sense. She wanted the fence gone. She wanted a better view. She wanted control. Instead, she was about to get transparency. Complete transparency. And she was going to pay for it. Not just financially, but every single day she looked outside. I folded the documents carefully, placed them in a new folder, labeled it. Then I picked up my phone. The first call was to a construction attorney, someone who understood how to make things. Unquestionably legal. The second call was to a former colleague, materials specialist. The kind of person who didn't ask too many questions, but always had answers. "I need something strong," I said. "How strong?" he asked. I paused, then replied, "Stronger than anything she can break." He laughed. I might have something. By the end of that call, I had specifications, options, sources, things you don't find in regular construction catalogs, transparent materials, engineered for impact resistance, durability, clarity, not just glass, something better. I hung up and looked back at the plans one last time, then out the window, toward her house. She was outside, talking on her phone, walking along the edge of her yard like she owned every inch of it. I watched her for a moment, then shook my head slightly. "You really should have checked the paperwork," I muttered. Because in exactly a few weeks, everything she thought she owned was going to look very different. And for the first time since she showed up at my door, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was in control. And this time, the system was mine. The permits were approved faster than I expected, not because I rushed them, because they were solid, every document precise, every classification intentional, every line written in a way that made objections difficult. It wasn't a fence. It wasn't a barrier. It was a utility protection structure built along an active easement. That one detail made all the difference. Construction started on a Monday morning at exactly 7 a.m. The first thing she heard was the rumble of concrete. Trucks. The second was the sound of something she couldn't control. I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee when the first truck pulled in. Then another. Then a flatbed carrying materials wrapped in protective casing. Workers stepped out wearing hard hats and vests marked with contractor IDs. Efficient, focused, no wasted movement, right on schedule. Her sliding door flew open. She stepped out in a silk robe, hair barely put together, phone already in her hand. "What is this?" she shouted across the property line. No greeting, no hesitation, just outrage. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Construction." Her eyes narrowed. "You can't build anything there." I set the cup down on the railing. "Actually, I can." She didn't wait for more. Within minutes, she was on the phone, pacing, pointing, gesturing toward my property like she was trying to physically push the work to stop. It didn't. The crew moved like she wasn't even there. Measurements, markings, foundation, layout, everything happening with quiet precision. By 9:30, the first inspector arrived. Clipboard in hand, neutral expression, the kind of man who'd seen every type of neighbor dispute and stopped caring years ago. Bethany practically ran to him. "This is illegal," she said, pointing at the site. "He's building something on shared property. It violates HOA standards, zoning laws, everything." The inspector didn't react. He just walked past her and onto the site, spoke briefly with the foreman, reviewed the permits, checked the boundaries, then he turned back to her. "Everything here is within legal limits," he said calmly. "Permits are valid. Construction is approved." Silence. For a second, she just stared at him like she hadn't heard correctly. "That's not possible," she snapped. "That land is mine!" The inspector flipped a page on his clipboard. "According to county records, this section is part of an active utility easement." Her face changed, not completely, but enough. "What does that mean?" she demanded. "It means," he replied, "he has the right to build here within easement guidelines." That was the first crack. She didn't argue further, didn't scream, didn't escalate. She just stepped back slowly and went inside. By noon, the foundation work had begun. Concrete poured with measured precision, supports placed exactly where they needed to be. Every movement calculated, and then the materials arrived. The panels were delivered mid-afternoon. Carefully, unloaded, each one wrapped, sealed, protected, even covered, they had a presence, a weight. The foreman oversaw every step personally, no shortcuts, no guesswork. When the first panel was unwrapped, the entire site went quiet for a moment. Clear, perfectly clear, not like standard glass, no distortion, no tint, just pure transparency. Even Bethany came back outside, slowly this time. Carefully. She stopped a few feet from the property line, staring at the panel like she was trying to understand it. "What is that?" she asked. No anger this time, just confusion. I stepped off the porch and walked closer. "An upgrade," I said. She looked at me, then back at the panel, then at the foundation. And for the first time, I saw it. Realization starting to form. "You're replacing the fence?" she asked. I nodded once, her expression shifted. Not relief, something else, something uncertain. "With that?" she said. "Yes." She took a step back. Then another, looking from one end of the construction line to the other, measuring it, understanding it. "How long is this?" she asked quietly. I let the silence stretch for just a moment, then answered. 60 feet. That was the second crack, because now she understood something important. This wasn't smaller. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't something she could ignore. This was bigger than the fence, closer than the fence, permanent in a way the fence never was, and completely within the rules she thought she was using against me. By the second day, the structure started taking shape. Panels installed one by one, locked into place with precision fittings, each connection seamless, each alignment exact. From a distance, it almost disappeared. That was the point. But up close, it was undeniable. A solid, continuous surface running along the boundary, clear enough to see through perfectly, strong enough that no one was going to touch it. Bethany watched most of it from inside, through her window, phone in hand, always on calls, always trying something. More inspectors came, different departments, each one leaving the same way. No violations, no issues, no reason to stop. By the third day, she tried a different approach. She walked over during a break in construction. No phone, no anger, just a forced calm. "This doesn't have to get worse," she said. I looked at her, but didn't respond. "You've made your point," she continued. "The fence can stay if that's what you want. We can compromise." There it was. Not a demand, not a threat, a negotiation. I shook my head slightly. Too late for that. Her jaw tightened. "You're overreacting," she said. "This is excessive." I almost smiled. "Is it?" I asked. She didn't answer, because she already knew. By the end of the week, the structure was complete. 60 feet, edge to edge, flawless. The mountains behind it looked sharper somehow, framed, defined. Her view, unobstructed, exactly what she asked for. But now, there was something else. A boundary she couldn't ignore. A presence she couldn't control, and a problem she hadn't solved. I stood on my side, looking at the finished structure, then at her house beyond it. She stepped outside, slowly, looked at the wall, then at me. "This isn't over," she said. I nodded once. Of course it isn't. Because the wall was never the end. It was just the beginning. And she still didn't know what it was really going to cost her. The wall changed everything, not just physically, psychologically, where there used to be a solid barrier. There was now nothing to hide behind. Every movement, every reaction, every frustrated pacing step across her patio, visible. And she felt it, immediately. The next morning, she didn't come outside. No coffee on the patio. No phone calls in the open air. No confident walk along the property line. Just curtains. Closed. But that didn't last. Because people are creatures of habit. And control? Control is addictive. By the third day, she was back outside. Phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp, movements aggressive. And now, there was no fence to absorb it, no wood to block sound, no visual barrier to create distance. Everything carried, every complaint, every insult, every desperate attempt to regain control, and for the first time since this started, she wasn't the one controlling the environment anymore. That's when the attention started. At first, it was just curiosity. A couple walking their dog stopped on the road, staring at the structure. A car slowed down. Then another. By the end of the week, people were pulling over, taking pictures, pointing, talking. Not about her, about the wall. Is that glass? Is it real? How is that even allowed? I didn't advertise it, didn't promote it, didn't need to, because something like that draws attention on its own, she noticed. Of course she did. The first time a group of people stood near the edge of my property taking photos, she stormed outside. "This is private property," she snapped. They looked at her, then at the wall, then at me. I stayed where I was, calm, unbothered. "They're on my side," I said. "They're allowed to be there." She turned back to them, clearly expecting support. They didn't give it, because from their perspective, she was the one yelling. And that was the moment it shifted. Not legally, not structurally, socially. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the problem. The next escalation came 2 days later. I was in my workshop when I got the alert. Motion detection. Side, boundary. I pulled up the camera feed, and there she was, moving fast, looking around, holding something in her hand, a metal bar. I didn't rush outside, didn't call out, didn't interrupt. Just watched. She approached the wall like she expected it to give, like everything else eventually did. She raised the bar and swung. The sound rang out sharp and clean, metal against something that didn't react. The panel didn't crack, didn't flex, didn't even scratch. She froze, then tried again. Harder. Same result. The bar bounced back slightly, the impact traveling through her arms instead of the structure. That's when frustration took over. She dropped the bar, reached into a bag, pulled out a bottle. Liquid. Clear. She poured it along the base of the panel, across the surface, waiting. Nothing happened. The liquid slid down slowly and pooled on the ground. Useless. I saved the footage, backed it up, twice. Then I stepped outside. She hadn't noticed me yet, still staring at the panel like it had personally insulted her. "Having trouble?" I asked. She spun around, startled. Then, angry, then something else, something closer to panic. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. I shook my head. "No." I walked closer, stopped a few feet from the wall. "You're damaging a structure built on a legal easement," I said calmly. She laughed, sharp, unstable. "That thing is illegal." "No," I replied. "It's not." I let the silence sit for a second, then added, "And now I have proof of attempted property damage." That's when it hit her, not the words. The situation, the cameras, the evidence, the fact that this was no longer something she could control. She didn't respond, didn't argue. She just turned and walked back inside. Fast. That afternoon, things escalated again, but not from her. 2 unmarked cars pulled into her driveway, followed by a third. No sirens, no lights, just quiet authority. Watched from my porch as 3 people stepped out, badges visible, expressions neutral. They didn't knock gently. They knocked like they expected the door to open. It did. The conversation inside was too quiet to hear, but the body language told everything. Confusion, defensiveness, then realization, within. 20 minutes, boxes started coming out. Files, documents, electronics. More vehicles arrived, different agencies. Neighbors stepped outside, watching, whispering, and through it all, that wall stood there. Clear, unmoving, reflecting everything back perfectly. By evening, her entire driveway was filled with people she couldn't dismiss. Couldn't pressure. Couldn't control. She stepped outside once, looking directly at me. No. Anger this time, no confidence, just something hollow. Did you do this? She asked. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, I solved a problem. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, because she already knew the truth. This wasn't about the fence anymore. It never was. That night, her house stayed dark. No music, no calls, no movement, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when everything starts collapsing at once. And for the first time since she arrived, the neighborhood felt peaceful again. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because the final part was the one she was going to feel the most. Not in one moment, but every single month after. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt different, quieter, lighter, like something heavy had finally been removed. Her house stayed dark for 3 days. No cars, no music, no early morning phone calls echoing across the property line. Just silence. People noticed. Of course they did. Neighbors who had kept their distance started walking a little slower past my property. Some stopped to talk. Others just nodded. Word spreads fast in places like this. Faster when something big happens. And this was big. By the 4th day, a notice appeared on her front door. Official, unavoidable. By the 5th, a moving truck arrived. Not the kind you use when you're upgrading, the kind you use when you don't have a choice. I watched from my porch as workers carried out boxes, furniture, pieces of a life that had looked untouchable just a week ago. She didn't come outside, not at first, but eventually, she had to. Late afternoon, the sun low enough to cast long shadows across the glass. She stepped out slowly, no sunglasses, no perfect posture, no performance, just tired. For a moment she stood there, looking at the wall, at the reflection of her own house staring back at her. Then she turned toward me. You knew, she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded once. You could have said something, she added. Took a breath. You could have asked, I replied. Silence, not tense this time, just real. She looked back at her house, then at the driveway, then at the ground. I just wanted the view, she said quietly. I shook my head. No, I said. You wanted control. She didn't argue, because there wasn't anything left to argue. Few minutes later, someone from the property management company approached her, papers in hand, explaining something, pointing at signatures, deadlines. She nodded slowly, signed, and just like that, it was over. The house didn't stay empty for long. Within a month, it was listed again, but not for sale, for rent. Short-term vacation property. The listing photos were interesting. Every angle highlighted the same thing. The mountains, the view, the clarity, and right there in the background of every shot, the wall, not hidden, not avoided, featured. Experience unobstructed panoramic views, the description said. Unique architectural boundary enhancing visibility and privacy. I almost laughed when I read it, because they weren't wrong. The view was perfect, exactly what she wanted, just not the way she imagined. The first guests arrived 2 weeks later. Then more after that. People came for the mountains, but they stayed for the story. Some of them asked about the wall. Some already knew. A few even brought it up while standing right next to it, taking pictures like it was part of the attraction. I didn't mind, because something unexpected had happened. What started as a problem had turned into something else entirely. The space near the wall became a place people stopped, talked, shared stories. Neighbors who had barely spoken before started connecting. And the garden, the one behind where the old fence used to stand, felt different too, still quiet, still protected, but no longer hidden, and somehow that felt right. A few weeks later, I received the first official notice. Easement usage. Monthly fee. $200 due on the 1st of every month. I read it once, then set it aside, because I already knew it would be paid, not by her, but by whoever owned that house now. Because the structure wasn't going anywhere, the easement wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the agreement tied to it. The first payment came right on time, then the second, then the third. Consistent, predictable, just like any well-designed system. Months passed. The noise never came back. No more early morning disruptions. No more pressure. No more attempts to control something that wasn't hers. Just wind through the trees. The sound of birds returning, and the occasional quiet conversation from visitors standing near the wall. One morning, I sat on the bench in the garden, coffee in hand, the same place I used to sit before any of this started. The mountains stretched out beyond the glass. Clear, sharp, uninterrupted. Exactly as they should be. The wind chimes moved gently. A familiar sound. For a moment, everything felt still again. Not like before. Better. Because this time, it wasn't just peace. It was earned. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked out through the wall one more time. Because in the end, she got exactly what she asked for, a perfect view, and I got something better, control of my space, protection of what mattered, and a system that made sure no one would ever try that again, every month, like clockwork, paid in full.